The third kind of argument involves appealing to what is natural. And it basically goes something like this. We should preserve what's natural, or what's natural has a claim to be recognized and respected by us. Basically, ecosystems are good, species are good, and so on, because those things were produced by nature, or those things are a part of nature, and nature itself is something that's valuable or ought to be respected. And here are some examples of how this kind of argument shows up in the environmentalist literature. So a famous environmental ethicist, Callcott, said at one point that pain is natural, and so it's therefore a good thing. I mean, that he was arguing against animal liberationists, utilitarian animal liberationists, saying, utilitarian animal liberationists like Singer, they act like pain is this bad thing, but pain is a natural part of ecological processes. Pain is a way, it's a kind of information mechanism that tells organisms when things aren't going the way that would be best for them. And so pain is a natural thing. It's part of nature. It's not inherently bad. We shouldn't, if we say pain is bad, we're kind of pitting ourselves against nature and natural processes. Another example of the way that this shows up in environmentalist thinking, according to Sober, is when a different treatment is proposed for domesticated animals and for wild animals. So if it's thought that like domesticated pigs or cattle, that their suffering or their death doesn't matter as much as the death of cattle or pigs in the wild, for instance, or other kinds of organisms in the wild, that we need to preserve wild animals, but that domesticated animals, because they're domesticated, they're not part of nature, we have less of a responsibility in terms of preserving their welfare or preserving even just their lives and existence. And with both of these lines of reasoning, Sober thinks if you think about the reasons why, it's a little bit problematic to think that, for instance, just because a pig is domesticated as opposed to wild, that it's okay, that we have no responsibility to care for the welfare of the pig, or even that we have less responsibility to care for the pig. And he's going to give some reasons why this appeal to what is natural, even if the idea of appealing to what is natural at first looks like a good idea, arguments based on saying something is good because it's natural have some significant problems, which he's going to point out to us. So a first problem is that the word natural is an extremely ambiguous word. It can mean a lot of different things. So we can ask, like, if you say we ought to preserve what's natural, tell us what you mean by natural. What counts as natural? Because that word can mean a lot of different things. So here are some things it could mean. Sober, I think, just considers three things it could mean. It could mean whatever's part of the natural world, that is, whatever's part of nature rather than the supernatural world. But here we have to notice that this includes humans. You can try to make a distinction between, human technology and nature, but if you look at if you understand that humans are a part of nature, and Sober actually points out that this is a point that a lot of environmentalists themselves have emphasized, that humans shouldn't think of themselves as detached from or separate from nature. They're actually part of nature. They are themselves natural beings, they're organisms, and so on. And Sober agrees with that. So humans are a part of nature in that sense, in that very broad sense. And beavers build dams, birds build nests, and humans build machines and large buildings and irrigation systems and all kinds of other stuff. And there may be a different story about how it is humans begin to build irrigation systems as opposed to how beavers build dams. When humans build irrigation systems, they have to learn how to do that. There has to be a cultural background to support them doing that. Maybe a sort of the technology has to have been developed by previous generations of humans, and it's contingent whether or not that technology will have been developed. So, issues of history and culture come into play, but the fact of humans manipulating the environment to make it, operate in some way that serves their their lives and their interests and so on, is not, as a process, something that is outside of nature. It's something that takes place inside the same natural world as beavers and their dams and birds and their nests and so on. The word in contemporary biological literature, incidentally, is niche construction. So it's noticed, it's acknowledged widely among biologists, maybe some controversy, but it's acknowledged widely that organisms, all organisms, not just humans, act in such a way as to modify their environments, and that this can be a typical part of their behavior. So if this is true, I mean, or from this perspective that's given by contemporary biology, we can see that humans are a part of nature, and the things they do that look unnatural are not unnatural in some sense that takes them completely out of the same realm of behavior and of the material world that we see in the case of beaver dams and bird nests. A second thing that could be meant by natural is whatever exists before humans manipulate it or touch it. So here the natural would just be whatever hasn't been influenced by humans at all. And then finally, we could define the natural as whatever is normal or usual for a system. So if you hear ecologists talking about the natural state of the ecosystem, the natural state of the mountain or the land, they probably mean that as something like a state of balance that is sustained over a long period of time, the state that's normal for the system, or the state towards which the system tends. Sober's objections to these three definitions of natural are tailored. His objections are tailored to each of these different definitions. So basically what he's going to point out now is that each of these definitions of natural carries with it certain problems that make it hard to appeal to the natural to tell us what we should preserve. So the problem with the first definition is that if humans are a part of nature, I mean, if we say, oh, we mean natural in the sense of whatever's part of the natural world rather than the supernatural world. I mean, whatever is part of material reality and whatever is part of the evolution process and things like that, then this is going to include humans, and then that means everything humans do is natural too. There's not going to be a way to distinguish human behavior as unnatural because humans are organisms and they're participating in interactions with their environments just like other organisms are. If we say the natural is just whatever is not human or not interacted with by humans or affected by humans, then we can ask, why is this so important? I mean, aren't some of the things that humans do valuable as well? I mean, arguably humans, like, they build things of beauty or they build loving relationships with their communities. So there are things that humans do that, at least at first sight, look like valuable things. So we might say, okay, well, a non-human species operating in ecological balance with nature is maybe a good thing. We look at elephants, and they're beautiful and majestic, and we look at tigers, and we look at the rainforest and all the diversity in the rainforest, and these things impress us. Okay, we might say those things are valuable, but a lot of the things humans do, at least on the face of it, look valuable too. Skyscrapers are beautiful in a way, and human communities can be very beautiful and creative, and there can be a lot of mutual understanding, things that apparently look like valuable things to us. Human science, discovering truths about the world, seems like something that's valuable to us. One of the things that's valuable and that maybe should be preserved. So if we say that we should preserve what's natural and define natural as whatever is unaffected by humans, then there's a question of why we should give a special privilege to what's unaffected by humans, why we should treat that as especially valuable. Maybe nature, maybe the whole system of the world would be better if humans were in a kind of dynamic, maybe fluid relationship with the system. So we don't yet have a good reason to privilege what hasn't been touched or affected by humans at all in the way that the environmentalist wants to argue for this. And then the third objection is to the idea of the normal or usual in a system. Sober basically argues there's no good biological support for this idea. There's no good scientific support for this idea overall. So it may have been that ecologists at some point thought of ecosystems as having a kind of natural state, but Sober tells us, and I don't know, maybe we have to go and look at the ecological literature to decide, but this is what Sober says, writing in 1986, that most of ecology has abandoned that idea by now, that there's a lot more contingency in what shape an ecosystem takes. Ecosystems certainly change over long periods of geological time because the land changes. What is now much of the desert in the American Southwest at one point was an enormous lake, or even under in the ocean. So things change over long stretches of geological time, and ecosystems change over long stretches of geological time. And we know from biological evolution that species change over evolutionary time too. So the idea of there being something normal or natural for a system is really, at this point, it's no longer part of the most consistent contemporary scientific discourse. People don't really think in this way anymore about parts of the world having natures or having a natural state, that things are defective if they fall away from that natural state. Sober points to an earlier theorist, Aristotle, from the ancient Greek world, 2,500 years ago, who Aristotle believed that everything has a nature, in the sense that there's a typical way that oak trees behave, there's a typical way that rabbits behave, and so on, and that these species natures of these different things are what's driving their behavior. And when you find a rabbit that doesn't behave the way that rabbits naturally ought to, then it means there's something wrong with that rabbit. And so Aristotle was what's sometimes called an essentialist about all of these different parts of nature, that everything has its own distinctive essence, and it operates in the way that it does because of its essence. And again, Sober is thinking like an evolutionary biologist, partly because that's his background and training. He has worked a lot in philosophy of biology. But he's very much aware of like the Darwinian argument that species change over time. What formerly were characteristics of a particular plant or animal species, as the evolutionary history continues, pieces of that set of characteristics of that species may fall away. New things may get added. Different populations, subpopulations in the species may have different characteristics. In any population, any known biological population, there's any population of organisms of the same species existing in the wild. Laboratory situations are something kind of peculiar. It's not always this way in laboratories, but any population in the wild, there's a tremendous amount of genetic diversity in that population. So that means that there sometimes just is no kind of average or typical or normal case of an organism of a certain type. There's a lot of diversity within a population of organisms that interbreed with one another, thereby making them all a coherent species, that they can interbreed with one another. But there's no one type that is the kind of standard or normal type for that species. That's the way modern biologists think about organisms, and if Sober's right, about ecosystems. And so if this is true, then there's just no scientifically based idea of what's normal or natural for a system or for an organism on which the environmentalists can hang their claim that that's what needs to be preserved. They are not able to articulate on any kind of scientific grounds what the thing is that they say needs to be preserved.